My name is Mark Warner. I am the Senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I want to start by thanking my colleagues from around Europe and NATO and the EU and Canada who have joined the Atlantic Council in setting up this session. The origins of this came about when Senator Burr and I met with some of our colleagues a number of months ago from the UK, where they were starting a similar parliamentary inquiry to our Senate Intelligence inquiry about Russian interference in elections, in referendums, and in the political process. And it became clear that we needed to share information with our colleagues all across the West, as the fact that the tactics that were employed by Russia are not unique to America, but are a threat to democracies all across the West. Let me start by saying it's been a bit of a surreal week, capped off by an extraordinary press conference from Mr. Trump and Vladimir Putin today. We've seen in this last week President Trump treat our allies as adversaries and try to treat an adversary as if they're a friend. I stepped back for a moment and thought from a historical perspective where America, and for that matter, the world would be had President Kennedy, back in the early 60s, accept then Premier Khrushchev's allegation or assertion that don't worry about missiles in Cuba, there's nothing there. Or where the world would be if President Reagan had not so firmly kept the pressure on the Soviet Union and President Gorbachev to tear down the wall. If instead he had simply said, well, I'm going to bow down and accept the assurances of the Russian or then Soviet leader. The truth is that relations between Russia and the United States are challenged at this moment, not because of something that any American policymaker has done, but because Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, massively intervened in our elections in 2016, hacking into political parties, selectively releasing information to help then-candidate Trump and hurt candidate Clinton. They scanned or intervened in over 21 states' electoral systems, and Russian agents manipulated and used social media both in terms of paid advertising and fake accounts to spread dissension in the election process. The truth is that Russia has used these same tactics with many of our allies throughout and across Europe. And the truth is that even though Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin may call these witch hunts or fake news, we'll hear from my colleagues here and others from across long-term allies of the truth and validity of Russia's new strategy to manipulate and misuse the open democratic process. I'd also point out that as we drive this conversation, we spent a lot of time on the question of social media. Even the American companies that at first did not acknowledge or recognize the full extent of how they were misused, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, have all acknowledged Russian activity and misuse of their platforms. So, before I turn over to Damien, I want to make a couple of other quick points. There was a lot of conversation in this last week about NATO and the European Union. I believe the European Union is a strong entity that we need to continue to have strong relationships with. And I believe that NATO is the strongest alliance that America has ever had, has helped keep the peace for more than 70 years. And while it is appropriate that our NATO allies pay their full share, NATO is more than a defense alliance. It's an alliance of Western democracies that believe in rule of law, that believe and value a free press, that believe in the notion of one man, one vote. Those are values that are not represented by Mr. Putin and the Russian government, unfortunately, in 2018. So this challenge and threat will not go away. It is one that the West needs to stand strong on, and I am again so grateful for Fred Kemp and the Atlantic Council for putting together this session. And with that, I'd like to call upon Damien Collins, a member of the Parliament in the UK, who's been leading a similar parliamentary inquiry in that country. Damien?
Thank you, Senator. I'm Damien Collins. I chair the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee in the House of Commons. As the Senator mentioned, I met with him and Senator Burr in February when we were in Washington as part of our inquiry, and that was the start of some useful and fruitful conversations, and in some ways today's meeting is a significant development from that in bringing together representatives from other countries around the world that are looking at this issue as well. I think to do as President Trump did today, to deny the existence of evidence linking Russia to disinformation and interference in elections is effectively to say to countries around the world that are the victims of this, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe, but we've seen it across Europe and obviously here in the US as well, is effectively to say that you're on your own, that there's a level of disinterest. But I think what we're looking to demonstrate to do here today is to show that we're not on our own, that we are much stronger if we work together in confronting what is a threat to Western democracy. It is being pursued to fulfill Russia's strategic objectives, their hatred of multilateralism, and the way they seek to divide the Western alliance and to turn people against each other, to undermine the strength that comes from working together. So I think today's conversations have been incredibly useful in being able to share some of the common challenges that we face. And they're common challenges not just because of the intent of countries like Russia to disrupt elections in the West through disinformation, but also that many of the platforms that are used are common as well. And there is an inevitable focus on the role of major communication platforms like Facebook and Twitter in the way in which they can connect millions of people very, very quickly and very efficiently. There's been a huge focus on direct Russian activity through paid-for advertising through those platforms, but there is a huge problem as well with disinformation being spread through bot accounts, through fake accounts and fake profiles. I do believe that the tech companies have a responsibility to be more forthcoming with us about evidence and information that they hold about how this is being done and where it's being done from, but also crucially to inform citizens so that they can see where the information they receive is coming from. Is it from a legitimate political party or political campaign group? Where are they based? Are they based in their country or in a different country? Are they a legitimate commentator on this information? And that what we need to do is collectively call out Russian activity where we see it. We need to say to the tech companies they need to do more to disrupt it, and we need to give the users the tools they need to identify it so that they can dismiss that information and weigh it up against other things that they know. But I think we have to look at this in the round as a real threat and challenge to our democracy. Voters have to make informed choices based on real information, and that any attempt to blur that with disinformation will affect the democratic process. And this is one of the major challenges we face, particularly as social media is increasingly one of the primary means through which people consume news during election periods. Thank you.
We'll go to questions, and I hope we'll all ask our colleagues from Latvia, Ukraine, and the Czech Republic questions as well. So please, if you could identify yourself.
Region. What would you think? What do you think is the theoretically? What would be the reason for Russia even to invade Latvia? And Ambassador Kalnic, could you tell us the purpose of the new law for which you voted, which eliminates Russian language, existing Russian language education, including private schools and colleges in Latvia, and also why Alexander Kaponenko, who openly protested this law and wrote articles, why he is still in jail, which makes him basically one of the few political prisoners in Latvia. Thank you.
In terms of the forward deployment of NATO, I believe that has been reaffirmed out of the meeting, and clearly the ascension of all of the Baltic countries into NATO is terribly important that we stand by those neighbors. They have, in many ways, the lessons learned about Russian interference in the election system or on the internet, a lot of the lessons we should have taken better to heart what happened in Ukraine and Latvia and Estonia in prior years, and I think we would have been better prepared for 2016 if we had done that in this country. But Ambassador?
You know, one of the reasons that I'm here, and many of us are here, to talk about Russian interference in elections. And in Latvia, we've had this experience for 27 years since we restored independence in 1991, along with the military threat, which became very real after 2014 and the invasion of Ukraine. There's always been a political threat to try to undermine the government and the democratic systems from within. One of the methods for doing that is to rely on Russian speakers in Latvia who do not understand the Latvian language. So one of our goals has been to educate the younger community in Latvia to make them full-fledged Latvian citizens so that they speak Latvian and they speak other languages. So the goal of the law is not to eliminate the Russian language. That will never be eliminated. Almost everyone in Latvia speaks it, but it's to encourage further integration of the population in Latvia so they understand the state language and they can vote in the elections openly. As far as the last issue goes, I cannot respond to that.
Chris McGarry, Los Angeles Times. Question for, thank you. Chris McGarry, Los Angeles Times. Question for the European politicians here. Watching President Trump today not confront Russian political interference, how does that make you feel about the possibility the United States would back your countries if you faced or continue to face the same interference from Russia?
Thank you so much for this question. Today's discussion is very important for Ukraine because next year there is presidential and then parliamentary elections in Ukraine, and it's really important to use the recent experience from Ukraine from last year, especially the cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, banking system, energy sector, nuclear power plant, and to share this experience with our strategic partners here. This is how Ukraine could donate to counter, and because it's important not to talk about how to solve the problems, how to prevent potential interference in democratic processes in different countries of the world. Of course, in Ukraine today, everybody was, it seems like, watching the press conference because the issue of Crimea. And of course, we've seen another example of fake statement by Mr. President of Russia, showing that a fake referendum and others. But it's really important for Americans to show the strength of America. And I think to restore territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, including Crimea, this is about how to make America great again. And it's really important that in this issue, when everybody expected that there will be some painful compromises and there were lots of rumors, it's really important to see very firm position of the United States that Crimea belongs to Ukraine and no compromises at the expense of Ukraine. And also on the elections, I think that it's really important today to see about transatlantic unity, also how to follow the money, because how Russia is doing financing NGOs in different countries, in France, in Ukraine, paid by Russia and then interfering. And also besides this information, it's important not to allow Russians to receive more money by cash flow on energy projects. As Mr. Putin mentioned today, that Russia is a major gas and oil power in the world. Actually, it depends on us. Either we sponsor this major power by Nord Stream 2 allowing to be built in Europe or not, and limiting Russian opportunities then to use the cash to interfere for interference in the US election, in UK, in France, in Ukraine, because it's one of the way in 2018 to destabilize Ukraine using democratic election by having Putin's representative in Ukrainian parliament.
Thank you very much for this question. The narrative is very important, and Donald Trump can't set this narrative. However, I think the U.S. Senate and U.S. government has spoken quite clearly on what the policy towards Russia should be, and I'm quite grateful for that. Of course, it's a message to Europe, it's a message to us that we have to maybe put more into the alliance, and then we have to be ready to stand on our feet. However, I think it's also a big quest for others, for us, to be clear on Russia, to speak about those things openly, and to say that this is not the way how the Russians should be dealt with.
I was a pro-independence lobbyist here in Washington in the 80s, an ambassador in the 90s, and now I'm a member of Parliament. The U.S. Congress has always been 100% behind the Baltic states. They've understood our issues, they're very aware of our security concerns, and that relationship continues. We continue to visit, we get visits from senators to the Baltic states, and we think that the foreign policy experts, both in the Pentagon and the State Department and in Congress, understand the real situation. What the President says is something separate. I think that needs to be interpreted separately. But we feel confident that the Congress and the balance of powers here in Washington will continue to support what has been a very strong and a very clear position on the independence of the Baltic states and security in Europe.
I think we're seeing some really odd messages this week. Now, on one hand, the President has said to European countries, you need to be spending more on security and not rely on America. He's saying to some European countries, the influence of Russia in your country and your politics is too great. And then on the other hand, when given evidence of the interference of Russia in European countries, he's saying, no, that's not happening. And what he's saying to people is that, fine, if you confront Russia on that, you're doing it without my support, because I deny the advice of my own intelligence agencies that this is happening, despite the tech companies saying that it is.
And I would simply add 3 points. The Intelligence Committee in the Senate, in a bipartisan way, reaffirmed the findings of our whole intelligence community assessment that Russia interfered in the elections to help Trump and hurt Clinton. Mr. Trump's own intelligence appointees, from the Director of National Intelligence to the head of the FBI, to the head of the CIA, to the new head of the NSA, have all indicated Russia intervened, and we have to be on guard. Odin Coates said as recently as Friday that the lights were blinking red in terms of the level of threat that Russia poses to our democratic institutions going forward. And this is one of the reasons why our system of checks and balances has to work. The Senate went on record 98-2 in terms of support for NATO to send that strong message before the President took his trip. Earlier, there were over 95 senators and a huge majority in the House who voted to impose strict sanctions on Russia that did not give the President the ability to kind of back out, because while he may deny this threat in Helsinki, across the board in terms of the intelligence community, our defense community, and across the board in a bipartisan way, yes, we want better relations with Russia, but we want them on a basis where we recognize the threat and recognize the vulnerability and need to stay united with our European partners going forward.
Sorry, I got this one. Sean Lingus with CyberScoop. Senator Warner, I wanted to ask about the letter that you wrote to President Trump on Saturday with 7 of your Democratic colleagues. You're demanding the extradition of the 12 Russian military intelligence officers. I'm wondering, most people say that's unrealistic. Wondering what realistic measures you want to do to hold those 12 people accountable, and who on the Republican side would support that specifically. Thanks.
Well, we've already seen a statement from Senator McCain echoing concerns about the President going into this summit and not making Russian interference in our elections a top priority. I didn't get a chance because our session was started to hear all of the press conference. But one of the reasons we wanted additional individuals in the room on the American side was so that we could get a full readout of what actually happened in that one-on-one session. I think there remains a great deal of questions about how hard the President actually pushed Mr. Putin, not only in terms of the Russian interference, in terms of the indictments of these 12 GRU Russian spies who, with great detail, and I want to commend the special prosecutor for doing great work, that level of detail and proof on the Russian intervention. And most importantly, what he said to try to deter Mr. Putin from, and Russians from further intervention, not only in American elections, but in elections across the board. At least in what I heard from the press conference, I didn't get a very strong reassurance. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Drew Griffin with CNN. So I just wanted, are you saying there's a check and balance actually within the administration itself, that despite what Mr. Trump said today,
you are at least comforted that members of his own administration take this seriously and will be doing something to deter in the future election?
I am comforted by the fact that the Senate has acted in a broadly bipartisan way to reaffirm support for NATO, to impose strict sanctions on Russia, and time will tell. Clearly, we have posed questions to all of the leadership, at least of the intelligence community, and none of Mr. Trump's appointees in the intelligence community has denied Russian active measures, their involvement in the 2016 elections, and the fact that they will be back. And so time will tell whether those leaders and the agencies they represent help make sure that America is kept safe.
Thank you. My name is David Nikuradze. I represent Georgian television station Rustavito in Washington, D.C. Former American ambassadors to Georgia urged President Putin to raise the topic on Georgian occupation at a meeting with Russian President. However, we didn't see any sign or any official confirmation that they discussed this question. I wonder if you could tell me how important it is to bring Georgian issue. It's a conversation with Russian leaders. Thanks, sir.
I would simply say Russia's dealings with all nations in the region, and for that matter around the world, is important. And one of the reasons why I felt so strongly, and others, that there needed to be other individuals in the room so that we could get an accurate readout. I'm not, again, I'm not sure whether the Georgian issue was raised. Yes, please.
I just wanted to know sort of what you're expecting to hear from your Republican colleagues today. Do you think that Republican senators have been strong enough, even though there is agreement in Congress mostly that Russia did meddle? Do you think your Republican colleagues have been strong enough in communicating that to voters and regular Americans that they do think that happened, contradicting?
You've got the intelligence community that has confirmed Russian intervention. You've got the social media companies, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, confirming Russian interference. You have all of our partner countries from around Europe confirming Russian intervention. If some of my colleagues' heads aren't spinning after this morning's press conference, time will tell. I think we saw the votes last week with that concern, but in light of some of the president's comments today, I think there are times in the Senate when people will have to stand up and say which side you're on, and I think those are one of those times. This is one of those times.
This is up to be the final question.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Andrea Sideria from the Daily Beast. What can you do, what can Congress do to reassure our allies like the ones sitting up here that you guys do take this threat seriously in the wake of the president's comments? And what does President Putin's admission that he preferred Trump mean for the Senate intelligence investigation and also for the Mueller probe? Thank you.
Well, first of all, in terms of Putin's acknowledgement of preference for Trump, that's simply a confirmation of what the intelligence community under President Obama and the intelligence community under President Trump had already ascertained. It's also what the Senate Intelligence Committee, in a bipartisan fashion, a few weeks ago reasserted. So I think it's important that supporters, some of Mr. Trump's supporters, actually hear from Mr. Putin's lips his preference for Mr. Trump. It'll be curious to see some of their reactions. And what we talked about on a going forward basis was focus on components of election security, both at the ballot box and at the voter file level. Secondly, how we can have better cybersecurity around protection of our political parties and candidates. And third, the question of the use and misuse of social media, and particularly our colleagues in the UK are doing some really good work there. And while we may have to take on action on an individual basis, the more that we can share best practices, whether it's, as Member Collins has indicated, about geolocating of origination of a post. If it's saying somebody's posting saying they're in the UK or in Minnesota, but they're actually originating in a foreign domain. Questions about whether individuals should have the right to know where you're being contacted by an individual versus a bot or an automated account. I mean, there are issues that cross borders in this area that I think we need, we're just at the beginnings of a policy debate on. So I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to particularly thank my European colleagues and urge everyone to stay. Senator Rubio and I will be hosting a a roundtable on this subject very shortly, and then there will be, I believe, an open session later this afternoon. I can't stress enough how important it is to hear from our European colleagues, particularly those nations who have experienced this type of activity for many, many years. And in many ways, I go back to General Germazov, one of the Russian military chiefs, who back in 2011 basically outlined the 21st century Russian military doctrine, where he said, in a sense, that Russia could not compete with the full West in terms of total dollar amounts spent on tanks, guns, ships. But in the realm of cyber and misinformation and disinformation, Russia can compete and be successful. And clearly, so far, in terms of their disruption in the American election, more and more evidence of their disruption in the Brexit vote, their attempts to disrupt the Dutch elections, the French presidential elections, and obviously with some of the more countries of former Eastern Europe where they've been active for some time, that strategy has been successful. And in America and in the West, we have to have a better plan to counter it. Thank you all very much.